The Pacific Islands during World War II were a world unlike any other, a sweltering, unforgiving expanse where every step could mean life or death. Imagine a dense jungle where the air is thick with humidity, where sweat drips relentlessly, and the very ground beneath your feet is alive with insects, snakes, and disease-carrying mosquitoes. For the soldiers stationed there, survival was a constant calculation. Each heartbeat, each breath, each movement had to be measured carefully, for the environment itself was as dangerous as the enemy across the lines. For Private Hideo Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, the jungle was both home and prison. The canopy above barely allowed sunlight to pierce through, casting the forest floor into a dim green haze. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, mingling with the sharp tang of salt from the nearby seas. Every sound, a snapping branch, the rustle of leaves, or the distant boom of artillery, was a potential harbinger of death. Soldiers were trained to embrace this reality, to see death not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate honor for the emperor. Yet even the most disciplined could not prepare for the profound terror and bewilderment that awaited them when faced with an enemy unlike any they had imagined. The American forces, equipped with advanced weaponry and supported by a system of medical care far beyond anything the Japanese had encountered, seemed almost otherworldly. Tales began to circulate among Japanese troops of soldiers who should have died but were somehow pulled back from the brink. These were not mere rumors of luck or coincidence. Time and again, Japanese soldiers witnessed medics rushing into open fire, tending to the gravely wounded with skill and efficiency, and sending them back into the fray. The combination of courage, knowledge, and technology created the illusion of invincibility, challenging everything Hideo had learned about life, death, and honor. It was a place where reality and myth intertwined. The jungle demanded respect, and the enemy demanded fear. But what truly shook the Japanese soldiers was the realization that survival could be engineered. The American medic, armed not just with courage but with scientific innovation, transformed the battlefield into a theater of miracles. Wounds that should have been fatal were stabilized, infections prevented, and lives preserved against all odds. For soldiers like Hideo, this defiance of the expected natural order became a psychological weapon more potent than any artillery. In this story, we will journey into the blood-soaked jungles of the Pacific, exploring the experiences of those who fought and survived, and uncovering the remarkable strategies and technologies that changed the very definition of survival in war. You will witness courage that defied logic, ingenuity that saved lives, and the profound human spirit that refused to accept death as final. If you are fascinated by untold stories of history, strategies of survival, and the extraordinary bravery of those who risked everything, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that brings history to life. Join us as we step into a world where life and death are intertwined, and the true meaning of courage is revealed. In the heart of the Pacific jungles, where the sun barely pierced the dense canopy and the air was thick with humidity and the stench of decay, Japanese soldiers moved like shadows, silent and tense, acutely aware that every moment could be their last. The Imperial Japanese Army had instilled in them from the earliest days of training a philosophy that would shape their entire perception of life and death, a doctrine as old as the samurai but sharpened for modern warfare. To embrace death was not a tragedy but the ultimate act of loyalty and honor to the emperor. Life, in this worldview, was secondary to the mission, and any hesitation, any sign of weakness, could not be tolerated. Soldiers were drilled relentlessly to push beyond fear, to accept, to march into the fire without question, and above all, to understand that death on the battlefield was a sacred culmination of their duty rather than a failure. Yet the reality of combat was merciless, far more unforgiving than any lesson in a training camp. For every soldier who fell, the system itself offered little reprieve. Wounded comrades were often left where they lay, casualties of a doctrine that prioritized the living and the mission over the fallen. In the logistical calculus of the Japanese military, resources were always scarce, and the act of saving a wounded soldier required manpower, supplies, and time that could never be spared. An injured man was not just a burden on the physical plane, but a psychological complication to the relentless forward push of the unit. Bandages, medical kits, and basic antibiotics were rare luxuries. A medic on the front lines was a distant hope rather than a guarantee. Infection, starvation, and the unforgiving tropical environment ensured that a simple injury could become a slow, agonizing march toward death, and the system offered no safety net, no mechanism to halt that inevitable slide. Soldiers learned to internalize this truth, to steel themselves against the cries of comrades they could not save, and to carry on as though the fallen were already ghosts. Amid this grim reality, the stories began to circulate, rumors whispered from veteran to rookie, from one foxhole to another, tales that seemed almost impossible to believe. They spoke of Americans who did not follow the same rules of death, of men who fell and yet somehow returned to fight, of medics who ran unarmed into open fire and emerged with lives intact. At first, such stories were dismissed as exaggeration, the fevered imaginings of men pushed to the brink of exhaustion and terror. But when the rumors were witnessed firsthand, disbelief gave way to a profound and unsettling awe. In the humid haze of a jungle clearing, soldiers saw what appeared to be miracles. An American Marine struck down by a storm of bullets, his uniform stained with blood, yet within moments, a medic arrived, calm, deliberate, and unafraid, tending to the wound with precise, practiced hands, stabilizing the injured man, and seeing him lifted back into the fray. The contrast could not have been more striking. On one side, men conditioned to accept death and abandon the wounded. On the other, a system designed to preserve life, driven by courage, technology, and meticulous training. The psychological impact of this contrast was profound. For Japanese soldiers, the act of witnessing life preserved where death should have occurred was not merely a tactical observation, it was an existential confrontation. The rules that governed their understanding of mortality, the hard-earned truths they had relied upon to navigate the chaos of battle, seemed to crumble in the face of an enemy who operated under an entirely different set of principles. In the Japanese code, leaving the injured to die was not cruelty but necessity. It was a reflection of honor, efficiency, and the harsh arithmetic of survival. But when they observed Americans treating the wounded as precious assets, when they saw soldiers stabilized, treated, and returned to combat against odds that should have been fatal, the old doctrines felt inadequate, even obsolete. Every encounter with such resilience introduced a seed of fear, a subtle undermining of confidence that compounded the physical and mental toll of the jungle. The training that had once given Japanese soldiers strength now became a lens through which they experienced disbelief. They understood courage, but the American medics redefined it. They respected honor, but the system that valued every life challenged their fundamental assumptions. Soldiers who might have once seen surrender or retreat as weakness now faced the terrifying reality that the enemy's endurance was amplified by ingenuity and compassion as much as by weaponry. The battlefield was no longer simply a contest of firepower or tactics, it was a stage where life itself could be engineered, preserved, and returned, and where the absence of such systems in their own ranks made every injury a reminder of mortality, and every encounter with the Americans a confrontation with a seemingly unassailable force. Within this context, the ethos of embracing death transformed from a source of pride into a lens of horror. Soldiers like Private Hideo Tanaka navigated not only the physical dangers of the Pacific, but the mental dissonance of encountering a reality that contradicted every lesson they had learned. The cries of wounded comrades became a haunting soundscape, a constant reminder of what survival could be under a different philosophy, and what it meant to be abandoned under their own. Yet amidst this despair, the narrative also illuminates the extraordinary power of structured care, the way a systematic approach to medicine, logistics, and courage could reshape the battlefield and challenge the very perception of mortality. The Japanese soldiers' experience stands as a stark testament to the contrast between cultures of war, one steeped in sacrifice and honor, the other built on preservation, resilience, and the audacious belief that no soldier need be left behind, no matter the odds. In witnessing this divide, one begins to understand the profound psychological currents that shaped combat, morale, and strategy, and to see why stories of American medics resurrecting their comrades spread with such inevitability, becoming a legend born not of magic, but of a systematic, courageous defiance of death itself. In this story, the jungle, the heat, the blood, and the sweat become more than a backdrop. They are the crucible in which the myths of war are forged, and in which the human spirit is both tested and revealed. Amid the oppressive heat and ceaseless threat of the Pacific jungles, a different kind of courage emerged, one that did not wield a rifle or charge into enemy lines, yet shaped the course of battle in ways that were nothing short of miraculous. The American medics, often called docs by the soldiers they saved, embodied a philosophy that placed the value of life at the center of warfare, challenging the fatalistic views held by their adversaries. These men were trained not merely to patch wounds but to defy death itself, armed with a combination of knowledge, precision, and tools that seemed almost magical to those who had never seen them. They carried with them more than bandages. They carried an entire system of survival, a carefully honed methodology that could turn the tide of fate on a blood-soaked battlefield. To Japanese soldiers, who were conditioned to accept injury as a sentence to death, these medics appeared to perform acts that transcended human skill, acts that would later be whispered about in fear and awe as near resurrections of the fallen. The medics' arsenal began with the revolutionary power of antibiotics, most notably penicillin, a substance that in the jungles of the Pacific operated like a miracle in a bottle. Infections had long been the invisible killers of war, claiming more lives than bullets or artillery ever could, and the damp, bacterial-laden environment of the islands magnified this threat exponentially. A gunshot or shrapnel wound, left untreated, could quickly transform into gangrene, turning a man's flesh into a blackened, rotting testament to nature's cruelty. Yet with penicillin, medics could halt the spread of these deadly bacteria, stabilizing the most critical cases and giving soldiers a chance to survive wounds that would have been fatal just a generation earlier. It was an innovation that did not merely save lives. It rewrote the rules of engagement, presenting an enemy who expected death with the impossible sight of resilience and recovery. Even more immediate, more visibly astonishing, was the use of freeze-dried plasma. Compact, portable, and designed to be mixed quickly in the chaos of the front line. This powder was capable of restoring blood volume in men who were on the brink of collapse, whose bodies teetered on the edge of mortality. To witness a medic mix this unassuming powder with water and administer it through a carefully designed intravenous system was to witness the literal revival of a soldier from the precipice of death. The Japanese observers, unfamiliar with intravenous therapy or the physiology that underpinned it, could only interpret this as a defiance of the natural order. A man who should have been a corpse was revived with color returning to his face, his pulse steadying, his breathing stabilizing, a performance that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision and speed, yet was grounded entirely in the scientific advancements and logistical preparation of the U.S. military. Morphine, another essential tool, added yet another layer to this extraordinary capacity to preserve life. In a world where untreated wounds often meant excruciating agony as the body succumbed to trauma and infection, morphine administration allowed medics to manage pain in a controlled, rapid manner, giving soldiers a chance not only to survive but to retain enough consciousness and strength to endure evacuation and subsequent care. Every injection, every measured dose, was part of a system that transformed individual courage into collective resilience, ensuring that the human cost of battle did not escalate as inevitably as it had in previous conflicts. It was an integration of science, logistics, and bravery, executed under fire, that created the illusion of invincibility to those who could not fathom such capabilities. The impact of these interventions was immediate and deeply psychological. For American troops, the presence of a medic on the field was a lifeline, a reassurance that injury did not mean the end, that the machinery of survival had been engineered to operate with military precision. For the Japanese soldiers observing from across the lines, these acts were terrifying, inexplicable, and awe-inspiring. Time and again, they watched comrades fall to gunfire, sustain wounds that should have been mortal, and then rise again through the calculated, almost ritualized actions of a medic. What they interpreted as supernatural was, in reality, the product of rigorous training, scientific innovation, and a logistical system designed to preserve every possible life. The battlefield became a theater where courage and technology intersected. The medics risked their own lives to retrieve the wounded, ignoring bullets and shellfire, driven by a doctrine that honored life in a way foreign to the culture of their enemies. Each rescue, each stabilization, was a performance of both human valor and the industrial might of a nation that had committed itself not only to winning battles, but to redefining what survival meant in modern warfare. These moments, repeated across countless islands and jungles, solidified a perception among Japanese soldiers that they were facing a force that could rewrite the finality of death itself, that their efforts to end a life could be undone before their eyes. The stories of these medics, of men like Desmond Doss who braved enemy fire to carry dozens of wounded to safety, became emblematic of this system of life preservation. They were not isolated acts of heroism, but integral parts of a network designed to sustain the fighting force. A reminder that the American approach to war valued every individual as a critical component of a greater mission. By combining penicillin, plasma, morphine, and meticulous battlefield training, medics created a reality in which survival was systematically achievable, reshaping morale, strategy, and even the mythos of combat. The courage of the medic, fused with the precision of science, became one of the most decisive and underappreciated factors in the Pacific theater, ensuring that life could be preserved against overwhelming odds and instilling in soldiers and observers alike a profound respect for the power of human ingenuity. In exploring this story, we see that the battlefield was never merely a contest of weaponry. It was a crucible where knowledge, courage, and compassion converged to redefine the very boundaries of human endurance. The American medic was the embodiment of this convergence, a figure whose actions were both deeply human and undeniably transformative, challenging old notions of inevitability in death and forever altering the psychology of warfare, both for those who benefited from their skill and those who witnessed it from across the lines. In the dense, humid jungles of the Pacific, where the air clung to skin like a heavy shroud and the cries of the wounded were swallowed by the relentless cacophony of war, Japanese soldiers found themselves confronting a phenomenon that defied all prior understanding. Battle-hardened and trained to accept the inevitability of death, they had internalized a world in which the injured were liabilities, their survival a secondary concern at best. and their suffering often an unavoidable testament to the harsh calculus of warfare. Every fall of a comrade, every bloodied form left behind in the mud or tangled under foliage, was a stark reminder of the philosophy that had guided them for years. Life was expendable in the service of duty. And death, when it came, was both natural and honorable. Yet as they crouched in concealed positions, eyes wide with disbelief, they began to witness actions that contradicted the very laws of mortality they had been taught to respect. Across open clearings and amidst the crack of rifle fire, the Japanese watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as American soldiers, struck down by gunfire or shredded by shrapnel, did not succumb to the expected stillness of death. Medics, moving with deliberate calm through the chaos, knelt beside these wounded men, their hands steady and precise, as though performing a ritual whose purpose was not only to save but to rewrite reality itself. Bandages were applied, antiseptics poured, and the miraculous instruments of field medicine plasma kits, morphine injectors, and early antibiotics were deployed with an efficiency that seemed impossible under fire. To the Japanese observer, every heartbeat sustained, every color restored to a pale face, every groan transformed into speech, appeared less like medicine and more like magic, a conjuring of life from the very jaws of death. It was not a singular occurrence, but a pattern repeated across island after island, battlefield after battlefield, forming a vision that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Soldiers who should have been corpses were lifted, carried, and ultimately returned to the ranks, sometimes within hours, sometimes within days, their wounds stabilized and their survival guaranteed by a system that seemed flawless in its execution. The contrast with the Japanese experience was stark and devastating. While their comrades, when injured, were often left to fade into fever, infection, or final, lonely agony, the Americans treated the preservation of life as both a strategy and a sacred obligation. This was a new kind of warfare, one in which the lines between reality and miracle blurred, and the very act of survival became a weapon, a psychological force that could inspire awe and terror in equal measure. From the perspective of a Japanese soldier like Private Hideo Tanaka, the implications were staggering. He had grown accustomed to seeing injury as synonymous with death, had internalized the logic that a wound meant a final exit from the battlefield, and had accepted the doctrine that emphasized offensive spirit and sacrifice above all else. Yet here, unfolding before him, was a world in which injury did not equate to loss, where the human body, under the care of highly trained medics, could be returned from the edge of oblivion. Each rescue undermined his assumptions. Each revival challenged the philosophical and tactical certainties that had guided his life. Over time, these experiences accumulated, weaving a narrative that bordered on the supernatural. Americans could survive, repeatedly, where death should have been absolute, and their medics were the arbiters of this defiance. The mechanics behind these seemingly miraculous recoveries were rooted in innovation and preparation that the Japanese soldiers could scarcely comprehend. Penicillin, a substance that curtailed infections that would otherwise have been fatal, transformed the trajectory of battlefield injuries. Freeze-dried plasma restored blood volume with near-magical immediacy, and morphine eased the excruciating pain that might have broken a man's will to survive. These tools, combined with rigorous medical training and a culture of prioritizing life even in the midst of combat, created a system so effective that observers could only interpret it as supernatural. For soldiers raised in a culture where a serious wound almost invariably led to death, the regularity of American survival appeared to violate the natural order, as though death itself had been temporarily suspended at the whims of a competent and fearless medic. Beyond the physical revival of the injured, there was a psychological dimension to the effect. To witness a comrade rise from what should have been a fatal wound instilled a sense of disbelief. a creeping unease that began to erode confidence in traditional notions of honor and the inevitability of death. For the Japanese soldier, each encounter with a saved American reinforced a stark conclusion. They were facing an enemy not only of superior firepower but of superior systems, strategy, and, above all, belief in the sanctity of life. The battlefield was no longer simply a contest of skill or courage. It had become a theater in which survival itself could be engineered and manipulated, challenging every expectation and reshaping the emotional and moral landscape of those who observed it. Even in the midst of relentless combat, these experiences became stories shared in whispered conversations, tales of what could only be described as resurrection. The repetition of such events across different units and locations cemented the legend of the unkillable American soldier in the minds of Japanese troops. A myth born not of superstition but of consistent observation of practices and technologies they could not match. Each revival, each stabilization, each return to the ranks demonstrated a power that was simultaneously practical and awe-inspiring, a proof that human ingenuity, when applied systematically, could bend the most fundamental assumptions of life and death. As Private Tanaka and his comrades grappled with these realities, their worldview began to fracture under the weight of undeniable evidence. They were witnessing not isolated miracles, but the predictable results of a system designed to preserve, heal, and return soldiers to the fight. A system whose sophistication and effectiveness far outstripped their own. The American medic became, in their eyes, a figure of near-mythical capability, capable of rendering the ultimate sacrifice of the battlefield, the death of a comrade, irrelevant, in ways they could scarcely reconcile. These observations did not merely inform strategy or morale. They reshaped the very meaning of warfare itself, demonstrating that survival, when engineered with intelligence, courage, and unflinching discipline, could become as decisive a force as the bullets and bombs that rained across the islands. The repeated witnessing of these survivals forged a lasting impression, a narrative that Japanese soldiers carried with them beyond the jungles, beyond the battles, a story of the extraordinary capacity of American medics to defy what had been understood as immutable. They saw the battlefield not just as a contest of arms but as a place where human ingenuity and compassion could overturn the finality of death, leaving an indelible mark on their understanding of courage, mortality, and the bounds of possibility in war. The sprawling Pacific Islands, drenched in sweat, rain, and the constant scent of gunpowder, were more than just battlegrounds. They were crucibles in which the stark differences between two armies were laid bare in the most visceral ways imaginable. For the Japanese soldier, trained to embrace death as an honor and conditioned to accept the inevitability of suffering when wounded, the battlefield was a place where every injury was a potential sentence, where every casualty was a reminder of the logistical and philosophical constraints that governed their existence. They moved through the dense undergrowth with a fatalistic precision, their eyes scanning for the enemy while simultaneously preparing for the moment when a bullet or shrapnel would end the life of a comrade or themselves. Every step was measured, every decision filtered through a culture steeped in the Bushido ideals of loyalty, courage, and the ultimate sacrifice. Yet across the front, the American forces were operating under a radically different paradigm, one in which the preservation of life was engineered with an intensity and sophistication that seemed almost inconceivable to their opponents. A paradigm that would redefine the very nature of survival in war. American battlefield medicine was not a matter of improvisation or luck. It was the culmination of industrial-scale planning, scientific advancement, and meticulous logistics. Long before the first troop landed on any contested beach, a network of preparation was already in motion, stretching from the factories of the United States to the forward positions scattered across the Pacific. Antibiotics like penicillin were produced in unprecedented quantities, Freeze-dried plasma kits were prepackaged and ready to be deployed within minutes. And morphine and other essential medications were carefully rationed and distributed to medics trained in the precise administration of these life-saving interventions. Each element of this system was designed to counteract the most lethal aspects of combat, from blood loss to infection, ensuring that the human cost of war could be mitigated wherever possible. To the Japanese observer, witnessing these measures in action was like peering into a world governed by rules entirely alien to their own. A soldier wounded in the most extreme circumstances could be revived, treated, and returned to the ranks with a consistency that seemed almost supernatural. The contrast was stark not only in resources but in philosophy, where Japanese doctrine, shaped by both tradition and necessity, regarded wounded soldiers as liabilities. The American military viewed every man as a vital component of the war machine, whose survival was of paramount importance. This ethos was embedded in the training of medics, who were not merely first responders but specialists in anatomy, physiology, and trauma care, rigorously drilled to operate under fire while managing the most complex medical emergencies imaginable. Their presence transformed the battlefield into a space where injury no longer meant the end, where the inevitability of death could be challenged through a combination of courage, science, and industrial efficiency. For the Japanese soldier, whose understanding of battlefield care was limited to makeshift dressings, scarce supplies, and the expectation of inevitable demise, the American approach appeared not only alien but almost magical, a demonstration of human ingenuity harnessed on a scale that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The logistics that supported this system were equally extraordinary. From the moment a soldier fell, a chain of intervention was triggered, moving from the front lines to field hospitals and onward to fully equipped surgical units. Every step of this journey had been anticipated, tested, and refined to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. Medics carried with them not only medical supplies but detailed knowledge of triage, stabilization, and evacuation procedures, ensuring that the wounded were not simply rescued but systematically reintegrated into the care network. Freeze-dried plasma could be mixed with water to restore vital blood volume in minutes. Morphine could be administered with speed and precision to alleviate pain. Penicillin could neutralize infections that, in other circumstances, would have claimed a life within days. The combined effect of these measures was not merely survival, it was a demonstration of control over circumstances that, for the Japanese soldier, had always seemed governed by chaos and inevitability. This systematic approach was inseparable from the industrial and scientific might of the United States, a country capable of producing trillions of doses of antibiotics, manufacturing medical equipment at a scale previously unimaginable, and sustaining a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles across the ocean. Every aspect of combat medicine, from the individual medic's kit to the logistical orchestration of field hospitals and surgical units, reflected a philosophy that valued life as both a moral imperative and a strategic advantage. The ability to save a soldier's life was not incidental. It was an intentional, methodical application of knowledge, resources, and planning designed to maintain the fighting capacity of the army under conditions that would have otherwise been catastrophic. For Japanese soldiers, the implications were profound and disorienting. In a context where injury had historically meant suffering and certain death, the repeated observation of Americans surviving wounds that should have been fatal created a cognitive dissonance that was impossible to reconcile within their established framework of honor and duty. Every instance of a medic stabilizing a soldier, of a plasma transfusion restoring life, of an antibiotic preventing infection, was a direct challenge to their understanding of warfare and the natural order of mortality. It became evident that they were not merely facing an opponent with superior firepower, but a force that had industrialized the very preservation of life, creating an operational advantage that was both practical and psychologically destabilizing. the battlefield, therefore, was a theatre not only of combat but of ingenuity and logistics, where human skill and industrial capability intersected to rewrite the rules of survival. Japanese soldiers witnessed firsthand that these practices were neither flukes nor isolated incidents, but the consistent product of a system designed to ensure that death was never final, and that every soldier's potential for survival could be maximized. The American medic, empowered by training, tools, and a logistical network that was industrial in scale, became the living embodiment of this philosophy. A figure capable of turning near certain death into survival, and thereby altering the perception of the enemy. The dynamics of morale, and the very nature of warfare itself. In this stark contrast between preparation and deprivation, between systematic care and fatalistic neglect, the Japanese soldiers came to understand a critical reality. Victory in the Pacific was not determined solely by bullets, bombs, or brute force, but by a nation's ability to integrate science, industry, and logistics to sustain life, to preserve its fighting force, and to impose a form of control over death itself that had never before been seen in the history of war. As the humid air pressed heavily against their skin and the cries of the wounded echoed through the dense foliage, Japanese soldiers found themselves grappling with an experience that defied both training and imagination, a confrontation with a reality that seemed to undermine the very principles that had guided them through years of disciplined preparation and unflinching obedience. Time and again, they observed American medics moving fearlessly through hailstorms of bullets, kneeling beside soldiers whose bodies had been torn apart by gunfire, shrapnel, and shell fragments, and applying techniques that, to any conventional understanding, should have been impossible under such conditions. The wounded were stabilized, infections held at bay, blood volume restored, and consciousness regained, all in the midst of chaos that would have overwhelmed the most composed of men. For the Japanese observer, whose experience had conditioned him to expect that serious wounds were inevitably fatal, these repeated survivals created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance, a clash between expectation and reality that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. In the face of such displays, the carefully constructed mental frameworks that had guided these soldiers began to erode. The doctrine that valor and honor were measured by the willingness to embrace death suddenly seemed inadequate in the context of an enemy whose battlefield ethos was rooted not in fatalism, but in the systematic preservation of life. Each time an American soldier rose from a wound that would have assured death for a Japanese counterpart, a silent terror gripped the hearts of those watching, a recognition that they were not merely contending with superior training or firepower, but with a force that had transformed the very rules of survival into a predictable, almost mechanical certainty. The efficiency of these medical interventions, administering penicillin to prevent deadly infections, mixing freeze-dried plasma to restore vital blood volume, and applying morphine to relieve excruciating pain did not merely save lives. They projected a vision of control over death itself, a concept that clashed violently with the fatalistic worldview of the Japanese soldier. This confrontation with what appeared to be miraculous survival instilled a complex blend of emotions. Fear was ever present, born not only from the immediate threat of bullets and artillery, but from the realization that the enemy possessed capabilities that rendered traditional tactics and assumptions increasingly irrelevant, or followed closely, a reluctant admiration for the ingenuity, courage, and precision that enabled American medics to operate under fire with such effectiveness. A recognition that what they were witnessing was the product of meticulous planning, scientific advancement, and industrial-scale logistics, and above all, a sense of futility began to take root, a gnawing despair that eroded morale and challenged the very motivation that had sustained these soldiers through countless battles. How could one fight with conviction against an opponent whose wounded were routinely restored to life, whose systems ensured that loss was minimized, and whose methods appeared to elevate survival to an art form. In the quiet moments between engagements, the soldiers shared these experiences in hushed tones, stories that spread along the lines like wildfire, tales of comrades falling, only to rise again under the ministrations of the enemy's medics, became part of the folklore of the battlefield, a sequence of events so consistent and repeated that it could not be dismissed as mere luck or coincidence. Each story reinforced the perception of an enemy who operated on a plane far removed from ordinary human constraints, whose ability to preserve life seemed to defy not just tactical expectations but the very laws of nature itself. This accumulation of observation and narrative began to shape the psychology of entire units, fostering a pervasive awareness that every engagement carried with it the shadow of inevitability. The enemy could absorb what would have been fatal, and the inevitability of death that had defined their own experiences no longer applied in the same way across the battlefield. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond fear and awe. It challenged fundamental assumptions about honor, duty, and the value of life. In a culture where the highest virtues had been instilled through a combination of philosophy and necessity, where the wounded were often left behind to die as a reflection of both logistics and doctrine, witnessing the systematic rescue of enemies was a form of moral dislocation. The Japanese soldier could not reconcile his own experiences with the American model of care. The structured and almost ritualistic efficiency of battlefield medicine became, in his, a demonstration of a reality that was fundamentally alien. The repeated survival of wounded soldiers created a perception of the enemy as invulnerable in ways that transcended mere physical protection, fostering a sense of helplessness and a creeping erosion of confidence in traditional strategies and beliefs. This psychological dimension was compounded by the meticulous coordination underlying every rescue. Medics did not act impulsively or chaotically. They were part of a system designed to maximize survival, a network in which every action from triage to stabilization to evacuation was carefully orchestrated and executed. For Japanese soldiers, the clarity and effectiveness of this system were as confounding as the survival it produced. The battlefield, once a realm of predictable outcomes dictated by courage, skill, and opportunity, had been transformed into a domain in which death was no longer the final arbiter, and where the enemy's capacity to preserve life created an almost supernatural impression. Even the simplest observation could unsettle deeply held convictions. Watching a man strike down by gunfire be lifted from the mud, his pallor giving way to color, his pain alleviated, his life restored, created an immediate, visceral response. The Japanese soldier, whose cultural and logistical framework dictated that such a man should be dead, could only stare in disbelief, grappling with the impossible, struggling to integrate this new reality into his understanding of the world. It was a continuous, unrelenting psychological pressure, a demonstration that the war was not simply a matter of skill, bravery, or firepower, but also of an industrial and scientific capacity to bend the natural course of life and death. The cumulative effect of these observations forged a battlefield consciousness defined by a mixture of fear, awe, and futility, a recognition that they were confronting an enemy who had mastered survival as methodically as they had mastered offense. It became clear that the Americans' ability to save lives was not incidental or miraculous in the random sense, but the product of a deliberate, systematic, and technologically supported approach, one that rendered traditional expectations of mortality irrelevant and reshaped the very landscape of psychological warfare. The Japanese soldier, trained to accept death as inevitable, now faced the harrowing truth that survival could be engineered. And in that realization lay a disquieting, unshakable power, one that would haunt his perceptions of courage, strategy, and the limits of human endurance for the remainder of the conflict. In the sweltering chaos of Okinawa, where the air was thick with smoke, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless roar of artillery, one man moved with a calm determination that seemed almost otherworldly against the backdrop of destruction. Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector driven by faith and a profound respect for life, refused to carry a weapon. Yet he became one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of battlefield medicine, a living testament to courage and the life-saving power of systematic preparation. While bullets tore through the air and explosions reduced the landscape to jagged ruins, Doss navigated the treacherous terrain with a singular purpose: to save the lives of his fellow soldiers. Knowing that each step carried the potential for his own death, yet fueled by a steadfast conviction that every man was worth the risk, his actions were not born of impulse but of a deeply ingrained belief in the sanctity of life. A philosophy that intertwined personal bravery with the broader system of medical innovation and logistical mastery that defined American wartime strategy. The Pacific theater of World War II had been a crucible where the brutal realities of combat were magnified by heat, disease, and the isolation of island fighting. Japanese doctrine emphasized honor in death and often left wounded soldiers to succumb to their injuries, viewing survival as a distraction from the mission and resources as too scarce to expend on the injured. Against this harsh backdrop, the American approach seemed almost miraculous, a fusion of industrial-scale preparation, scientific innovation, and the relentless courage of medics who risked everything to rescue the fallen. Desmond Doss became the embodiment of this philosophy, demonstrating through repeated acts of heroism how a soldier could defy the conventional expectations of mortality on the battlefield. He moved among the wounded with precision and calm, stabilizing their injuries, applying early antibiotics to prevent infection, administering morphine to manage pain, and using portable plasma to replace lost blood, all under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Each successful rescue was a reinforcement not only of survival but of the trust that soldiers placed in the system itself. A tangible assurance that their lives mattered and that they were part of a network capable of countering the deadliest consequences of combat. The effect on American forces was profound. Witnessing Doss and his fellow medics repeatedly risk their lives for the wounded instilled a sense of confidence and cohesion that transcended fear and fatigue. Soldiers were able to engage the enemy with greater aggression, knowing that should they be injured, trained specialists equipped with advanced tools and knowledge would intervene to save them. The morale boost was immeasurable. It reinforced the notion that every soldier was a valued component of the mission, and that survival was not left to chance, but was actively pursued by a system designed to protect life even amidst the most chaotic and dangerous circumstances. This approach transformed the battlefield from a place of inevitable attrition to a space where courage, skill, and scientific preparation could produce extraordinary outcomes, elevating the effectiveness of the entire fighting force. For Japanese soldiers observing these interventions from the periphery, the scene was surreal. Their military culture had taught them that serious wounds meant certain death, that comrades were often abandoned as a necessity dictated by doctrine and scarcity, and that the ultimate honor lay in a glorious end on the battlefield. Yet here were Americans, seemingly defying these fundamental laws of war and nature, with medics like Doss moving calmly among the carnage to stabilize, treat, and evacuate the wounded, who would then return to fighting or at least survive to recover. The psychological impact on enemy forces was immense. The perception of invincibility created by repeated, systematic life-saving actions instilled fear and a profound sense of futility, as it challenged every expectation and principle they had been taught. This juxtaposition of opposing philosophies, death as honor versus life as a protected resource, underscored the revolutionary nature of the American system and amplified its impact beyond the mere mechanics of combat. The heroism of Doss also revealed the power of integrating individual courage with systemic innovation. Each man he rescued became a testament to the broader philosophy that human life was invaluable, and that the preservation of one soldier could reinforce the morale and fighting spirit of many. His actions illustrated that bravery was not merely the willingness to face danger, but the conscious application of skill and knowledge to save others, a principle amplified by the industrial and medical resources behind him. The repeated successes of medics fostered a culture of resilience and mutual trust, a palpable assurance that the American military did not view its soldiers as disposable, but as essential contributors to a collective effort whose lives were actively protected. Desmond Doss' legacy, immortalized through his deeds at Okinawa and celebrated in countless accounts, epitomizes the profound intersection of courage, preparation, and medical innovation. The scene of a medic running through fire to lift a wounded soldier, administer critical treatment under impossible conditions, and deliver him to safety communicates more than heroism. It communicates a philosophy of war in which the preservation of life is as strategic and consequential as any offensive maneuver. Each rescue was not simply an act of compassion, but a reinforcement of morale, an enhancement of unit cohesion, and a vivid demonstration that industrial-scale logistics, advanced medical techniques, and personal bravery could converge to produce results that seemed almost miraculous. Through the lens of Doss' experiences, the story of battlefield medicine in the Pacific becomes a chronicle of systematic genius applied to the preservation of life. Courage, when combined with innovation and careful planning, amplified survival and reshaped the psychological terrain of war, creating a force that was not only resilient but also morally emboldened. The repeated, heroic interventions of medics like Doss reinforced the concept that every soldier's life had intrinsic value, that survival could be systematically pursued even in the harshest environments, and that bravery applied to saving lives could transform the dynamics of combat itself. In highlighting these extraordinary acts, the narrative illuminates the strategic, psychological, and human dimensions of warfare, demonstrating that the capacity to save a life, executed with skill and courage, is as decisive on the battlefield as any weapon of destruction, and that the true power of a fighting force lies not only in its ability to strike, but in its capacity to preserve, protect, and inspire. As we reach the close of this story, it becomes clear that the true measure of a military's strength does not rest solely in its ability to strike, to destroy, or to conquer, but equally in its capacity to preserve, protect, and sustain the lives of those who fight. The Pacific theater of World War II provides an extraordinary lens through which to examine this principle. Amidst the blazing sun, the suffocating humidity, and the deafening roar of artillery, American soldiers and medics operated within a meticulously designed system that elevated the value of human life to a strategic imperative. Every action taken to save a comrade, from the rapid application of morphine and the careful administration of freeze-dried plasma, to the transformative power of penicillin in preventing fatal infections, was more than medical procedure. It was a deliberate assertion that every life mattered, that survival was not left to chance, and that a soldier's value extended beyond the immediacy of the battlefield. Consider, for a moment, the courage of the medics, moving through open fire to reach the wounded, their actions executed with clinical precision yet fueled by immense personal bravery. Their work did not merely revive individuals, it reshaped the morale and cohesion of entire units. A soldier who knows he will not be abandoned, who trusts that his comrades and the system behind them will strive to preserve his life, engages in combat with a different mindset, more daring, more resolute, and more confident in the outcome. This assurance was not incidental but engineered through systematic training, logistical excellence, and the integration of advanced medical technology into the operational doctrine of the United States military. From the battlefield stretcher to the field hospital, from trench tents to fully equipped surgical units, each element was coordinated to maximize survival, and in doing so, multiplied the effectiveness of every soldier on the front line. For the Japanese soldiers who witnessed these interventions, the effect was profound and unsettling. They had been trained to view a wounded comrade as a liability, a burden, and in the harsh logic of their doctrine, often left him to die in the hope of preserving resources for the mission. To see American soldiers being stabilized, treated, and carried back to safety, then return to combat or recover fully, defied their understanding of the laws of nature and the rules of war they had internalized. What they interpreted as near miraculous resurrections was, in reality, the result of meticulous planning, industrial-scale logistics, and scientific innovation applied systematically in the theater of war. This contrast underscored a deeper lesson, that the preservation of life itself could serve as a decisive psychological and strategic advantage, eroding the morale of an enemy while reinforcing the strength and resolve of one's own forces. The story of individuals like Desmond Doss at Okinawa brings this principle into sharp focus. Doss did not carry a rifle, yet he became a linchpin in the survival of countless soldiers. Each life saved was not simply a triumph of bravery, but a demonstration of the broader system in which courage, knowledge, and technology were harmonized to create tangible, repeatable outcomes. His actions illustrate that strategic advantage is not exclusively derived from destructive capacity. It also emerges from the deliberate, organized, and courageous preservation of life. The battlefield becomes not only a contest of firepower, but a testament to the value placed on human life, a reality that resonates far beyond the immediate context of combat. When we reflect on this, the implications stretch beyond the Pacific theater or the specific historical moment of World War II. The principle that valuing and preserving life enhances strategic effectiveness is timeless. It suggests that in any conflict, or indeed in any organization or society, the systems we create to protect and sustain our members are as critical to overall success as those designed to achieve immediate objectives. It is a reminder that strength is multidimensional. It encompasses not only offensive power but also resilience, foresight, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. As we conclude this journey through the harrowing jungles of the Pacific, the courageous acts of medics under fire, and the transformative systems of battlefield medicine, take with you this insight. True power lies not merely in the capacity to take life, but in the ability to save it, to restore it, and to inspire hope in the midst of unimaginable adversity. It is a legacy of courage, innovation, and humanity that shaped the course of history and continues to inform how we think about strength, strategy, and the value of life today. Thank you so much for watching and exploring this incredible story with us. If you found this narrative as inspiring and thought-provoking as we did, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming content. Your support allows us to continue sharing these stories of bravery, resilience, and the extraordinary human spirit. Together, let us honor those who risked everything to save others, and remember that in every battlefield, the courage to preserve life can be as decisive as the courage to fight.